You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast series, Let's Talk Sustainable Business. The series is brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I will be talking to David Hone, Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell. First, let me introduce our guest. David joined Shell in 1980 after graduating as a chemical engineer from the University of Adelaide in Australia. He has worked in refinery technology, oil trading, and shipping for Shell. David is a board member of the International Emissions Trading Association and was its chairman from 2011 until 2013. He's a board member of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions in Washington, USA, and the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute in Melbourne, Australia. David posts regularly his energy and climate change blog and contributes to the Energy Collective, a US-based blog. He's also written a book on climate change, Putting the Genie Back, Solving the Climate and Energy Dilemma. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, David. And maybe as a start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with scenario planning?
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks for inviting me to the podcast today. So I think the scenario planning really came out of my involvement in Shell with the climate issue. So I'd been in Shell for, the first half of my career doing all the things that you talked about, and then an opportunity came up in the corporate, what was then the corporate center, around the climate change issue, and it obviously had a link, although this was 20 years ago, not entirely clear then what how it would link to the Shell's long-term strategy. But nevertheless, it was clear that this was a topical issue. And so I applied for and took up this role in the climate change space in Shell. And, at the time that was sitting actually, although it wasn't in the scenario team, it was sitting with the scenario planners. And there was a sort of an immediate synergy because the scenarios had already been, and this was, as again, 2001, the scenarios were already talking about the climate change issue and how it was, growing in scale and what it would mean for the energy system in the decades ahead. And so, we'd worked together very closely over many years. And then the opportunity came up for my job to actually be in the scenarios team about 4 years ago now. So that happened. But of course, the job itself has changed enormously over the years, because in 2001, I was Shell's climate change person. There was one person. Today, if you look at the full scope of energy transition and carbon management technologies and all the other things, there's hundreds of people involved in not in climate change, but in the reality of the issue and how it faces Shell. So anyway, that's how I got into the scenario team. I think it's a natural fit when you're looking at the climate issue, because how the world responds to this challenge is, it's bread and butter for scenario planning. It's what scenario planning is all about.
That's a good way into my next question to you. A lot of people talk scenarios all the time, and a lot of people talk about scenario planning. But I think it's worth our while to step back a little bit and say, what is it? What is the objective? How do you actually approach this in principle?
Yeah, so for some people it's a bit of a dark art, there's and we still get we still get talk around that in Shell, that we all go off and hide in the corner somewhere and come up with scenarios and no one's quite sure what happens. But that's not the case. No. So I think there's many ways of looking at the future and thinking about the future. One way is to do forecasts. So you look at where you are today, you're producing widgets, and the global widget demand is growing by 1% per annum. And so you calculate a forecast and you say, by 2030, the global widget demand will be X and our market share will be this. And all that assumes, of course, that the status quo of widget demand the use of widgets, the continued growth of that market just continues as it has in the past. And forecasts can be very useful, particularly for shorter term things. And we use forecasts a lot in the oil industry to look at short term demand changes and things like that. But scenario planning really tackles this from a different perspective. It looks at, well, what happens if the demand pattern changes completely? What happens if a better widget emerges and somebody invents a different process or a different approach to the service that you're providing, or the political stability that you relied on in the country where you manufacture or produce your widgets suddenly changes, and you can't access your facilities anymore. And so scenario planning it's there to stretch the thinking of forecasters into places that they may not be comfortable thinking about. It applies a methodology to what might otherwise be sort of a random collection of thoughts about, oh, what if the future changes? Okay, well, the future probably will change, and here's a structured approach to actually thinking about that and coming up with 2 or 3 or however many you feel is appropriate different views of the future, based on real trends and real developments that you can see today, but extended out, so that they become, perhaps the dominant theme of the day. And so, that's what's behind scenario planning. It's to stretch the mindset and stretch the thinking of planners, of strategists, so that they can really get their heads around, completely different outcomes, but nevertheless very plausible outcomes from where we are today. And I think we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, with big political changes in certain countries and the ramifications of that going forward.
Now, you see, I think one of the key points about scenario planning, as I see it, is not just necessarily be able to predict what the future is really going to be like, but to have a mindset that prepares you for potential significant disruptive changes and what the implications are. So you're much better prepared when these changes actually occur.
Well, exactly. And in fact, it's not about predicting the future at all, because nobody can do that. Or at least nobody that I've ever met. There's some people who have. Well, there's some people that have
channels on TV that.
Yeah, some people have some good guesses and they're right, and but if you have enough people guessing, then eventually somebody will be right. But exactly. So I think the way you've described it, that's brilliantly encapsulated. It is about preparing you for the future, and letting you see some of the alternatives that might emerge.
We cannot feature here the details of the structured approach, but it's a very structured approach, of course, and that helps you to focus the mind and have a methodology. But I think what we should do is encourage people to have a look at that methodology and apply it to their business, because it is so helpful. And there are possibilities to create a sort of signposts to say, along the line, when you have developed some scenarios, which are the more likely ones, in which direction it goes?
Well, even likely, we don't assign probabilities to our scenarios. What we do is that we come up with a set of plausible scenarios. So all of these could happen, but then to start to say, well, this is more likely than that, you start to get back into forecasting.
No, that's not what I meant. But once you have these way out scenarios, you can say along the line, the next years, you see which direction the things are going, and then fine tune.
That's true. I mean, one of the sort of post scenario steps is to establish you can establish a framework to look at signals and signposts and start to get a feeling for how things are changing, and maybe they are evolving in a particular direction. So that is another step that is part of the scenario planning process. Yep.
So you have done a massive exercise of applying your scenario planning methodology on different levels of potential global warming. Can you describe the scope and the approach of that exercise?
Yeah, so in February this year, we released what we call the energy transformation scenarios. And these are three scenarios that look at different ways in which the energy system might develop. They actually have their roots in a piece of work that we did last year called Rethinking the 2020s, which was a piece of work that looked at how the 2020s might radically change as a result of the pandemic. And I think that the pandemic was seen as a big enough disruption to the global sort of normal status or status quo uh, to mean that the 2020s and potentially beyond would be different. And so we identified, in that piece of work, three real tensions that are playing out. There's a tension around what we call wealth, which was the desire to rebuild quickly and get back to normal. And you see that with a lot of the stimulus bills going forward and the desire of economies to just get everything back together again. There was a second tension, which we called security, which is really about countries becoming more inward looking and thinking about their own circumstances in the pandemic. But that starts to shut down the global economy to a certain extent because it starts to upset, the sort of good cooperation that you need for the global economy to work properly. It maybe dampens trade a bit. And you see some examples of this. My own country, Australia, is sort of wrestling with this. Do we shut ourselves off or how do we open up again? It's a challenge. And then the third tension was the recognition that coming out of the pandemic, that actually the health and well-being of society is more important than anything else. And this isn't just the health of people relating to COVID; it's the broader aspect of health and well-being. And so these three tensions, which I think we can see pieces of today, and this is the sort of roots of scenario planning. What are the big tensions that you see around you? Have led to these three scenarios. A scenario called waves, where there's a push to rebuild, that climate change doesn't get as addressed as early as it needs to be. But there's a recognition of that, as we go into the 2030s, and then you get a wave of change in terms of moving away from fossil fuels. There's this island scenario that came out of the security drive, where it just all goes a bit slowly. And, even by the end of the century, we're not at net zero emissions. Emissions are slowly coming down, but not at anything like the pace necessary for meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then the third scenario, which we've called Sky 1.5, is really encapsulating this drive for health and well-being, and it leads to big change. It leads to environmental change. It leads to changes in people's mindset around how they consume, what they do, how they behave, and that delivers on the goals of the Paris Agreement. So these are the three scenarios. These three scenarios are plausible. The Sky one is particularly stretching because it requires a lot of change, but you can see some of those elements today emerging out of the pandemic. Not completely, but nevertheless, all of these three scenarios are still in play.
But before we get into the details of these scenarios, and it's extremely interesting and challenging to the mind, but can you talk a little bit about what the inputs were, how you actually got to, because it looked to me that you made a lot of quantitative analysis before you actually came up with these then qualitative scenarios.
Well, it's a combination of the two. So, the work around identifying the key tensions in society, that's a qualitative discussion, and we do that independently of quantitative analysis initially, although the quantitative part starts to feed in very quickly. And we set up workshops last year where we invited a broad range of external stakeholders who are experts in different fields, in social trends, and in we had an epidemiologist come in. You can think of a number of different people in the room or in the virtual room as it was, and they helped us, through the process, because the scenario process does involve, looking widely outside as well. You can't. It's quite difficult to just do it yourself. You've got to take external input to stretch your own thinking as scenario planners, and so we went through that process. But within the scenario team, we have a very strong modeling capability, and we run a system called the World Energy Model, um, which takes inputs from the likes of the International Energy Agency, all sorts of data sources that we get about energy demand and energy use. It takes in econometric data on GDP and GDP growth. It takes in population data from the UN, and we use that to model the energy system going forward. But we drive it with some of these qualitative pieces. There's lots of numeric. It's all obviously it's numerical, but you turn these qualitative thoughts into numerical drivers in terms of growth rates, or in terms of the desire of policymakers to put in a carbon price, for instance, or whatever emerges from your storylines, and then you model the energy system going forward. And then there's a bit of an iterative loop between the qualitative and the quantitative to arrive eventually at a story that's both substantial in its thinking, but also backed up by a set of numbers that are physically possible to have happen.
Let me just try whether I understood this correctly. So basically, you have an energy model that has relationships between population growth, GDP development, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And you then tweak certain knobs in that model based on your qualitative assumptions, and say, what if this were to happen, this would have these knock-on effects, and therefore these are then likely outcomes.
Yes, that's broadly it. Yes,
Yeah,
but
sorry.
of course that's a good description. But of course the knobs are in their hundreds. It's not just there's not just a couple of dials on the front. There's hundreds of inputs to this. But essentially that's what's going on. And then the model itself is quite a complex model, because it takes into account the cost of technologies, the availability of materials, the availability of resources. If you want to go off into a world where more and more natural gas is burned, for instance, you can't just do that because you think it's a good idea. Or you think that there's pushes in that direction. You may run into resource constraints that doesn't allow that to happen. And that's similarly true for things like metals, where there's a big drive for metals to go in, because these are key components in the renewable energy system.
Yeah.
Cobalt in batteries, nickel in batteries. There are limits on the resource availability of these, either the capacity to mine them or the physical quantity available globally. And so in a scenario, you have to start to build in those types of constraints as well, so that you can't come up with an implausible story.
Yeah. And I understand that this is a lot of knobs.
Yeah,
that is that's very clear. Now, we'll no doubt get to each of those scenarios and the implication. I just want to ask you now a question which is almost impossible to answer, but I'll ask you anyway. What do you think, based on what you've seen from the scenarios? Will we be able to get to the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5?
Right. Well, that's a pretty loaded question, isn't it? So our Sky 1.5 scenario, is called 1.5 for a reason. Um, it is a scenario that meets the goals of the Paris Agreement in a particular fashion. And I say that because what actually happens in the Sky scenario is that we overshoot 1.5 around the middle of the century. But there's a mechanism within it which is basically using large scale air capture and also large scale reforestation to rebalance the atmospheric carbon and actually start to bring it down a little bit so that by 2100 you're back to 1.5. So it's not a huge excursion. It gets to about 1.7, 1.8 degrees C. Um, I think to limit warming to 1.5 and not go above it looks extraordinarily difficult from today's perspective. We're as we saw in the recent IPCC report, we're at 1.2 degrees now of warming relative to pre-industrial level, and the carbon budget that's associated with additional warming to 1.5 is now so limited that it's consumed in under 10 years. So unless you had extremely rapid emission reductions in the space of a decade, it looks like we're headed for an overshoot. But I think that it's still a plausible story that we can recover from that and leave this century with limited warming.
Now, that is sort of depressing and getting a little light at the end of the tunnel for us. We have to dive deeper into that. Unfortunately, in this episode, we will not have enough time, but we will in the next episode dive a little bit deeper into these different scenarios and the implications. At the moment, I was intrigued by your mentioning that you really started about this rethinking the 20s in the light of the pandemic. How do you see the connection between that and the energy system panning out? I know that you said, depending on the tensions, how they develop, but how do you see the likely development in the light of today?
Well, I think the pandemic has challenged the global status quo. I think there's no doubt about that. It's just a question of how it's challenged it. We as I said, there's this desire to rebuild, but it's also left many people thinking about their longer term well-being, and we think that those sentiments are not short-lived sentiments. That this has been a big enough disruption to actually change things, and there's also physical changes. So for example, nobody's talking about us just all going back to work in exactly the same way as we were working in 2019. At Shell Centre in London, they've leased out half the building to somebody else because simply because there's a new ethic around the way in which people work, the flexibility that the company wants to give everybody, the time at which they think people want to spend in the office versus working at home. And so we've already started to establish changes. For instance, will business travel ever return to exactly where it was in 2019? Many people, so it probably won't stay at the very low level that it is now. But, a year and a half, and by the time we're done, it could be more than 2 years of, Zoom meetings and traveling to conferences virtually and presenting at conferences virtually. Leaves people with a new way of doing things. And of course, the technology has moved to help us do this better than we were doing it in 2018 and 2019. So we've imagined in the scenarios, particularly in the Sky 1.5, that these changes embed themselves in society and lead us off into a different energy future, just simply for those reasons. Let alone the sentiment and the feeling around it, and the political forces behind it as well.
But I understand the mobility one. That's very clear, and that's at least 20% of the carbon, as far as I get it. But would the pandemic have an influence on the choice of whether you insulate your home, whether companies are moving, let's say, to hydrogen instead of?
Well, I think not immediately. I mean, it might have an impact on people insulating their homes simply because they're spending more time there and they realize that their house is not quite as comfortable as they thought it was. So they start to make changes, and they make their home environment more suitable for a higher level of occupancy. But no, it doesn't immediately lead companies to require to move to hydrogen. I think that obviously comes out of a political process, but we saw this in the speech given by the Chinese president a few months ago, where he declared that China would be at net zero emissions by 2060. And he linked that back to the pandemic. He said, and it was a speech, and speeches are written by speechwriters, and, we can take it for what it is. But nevertheless, he made the point that, the situation we find ourselves has made us stop and think about where we're heading as a society, and the pressures that we're bringing to bear. And it certainly appears that the pandemic emerged out of perhaps out of environmental stress in the areas around Wuhan. We don't know exactly, but is it because of overuse of that land? We don't know, but nevertheless, I think he made that linkage, and he said, look, we've got to look more broadly at how we're living in this world, and one of the aspects of that is ensuring that we're not changing the surface temperature conditions, and therefore we're going to be at net zero emissions. So those linkages are there. They're tenuous, but they have. This is what the scenario planning is sort of brought to light, that it's changing people's mindsets, and mindsets eventually lead to big change.
Absolutely, and I think for business, the conclusion of what I just heard you say is have an open mind on the possible developments, and don't just extrapolate from the past. That is an important point. I mean, what we also see at the moment is that some people are talking about reshoring, shortening supply chains, and all of that. That actually might increase energy usage, because that's less efficient than the global division of labor, of course. So there is also the contrary going on.
Well, there is, and I think that's we try. So that's built more into the island scenario. And that's a scenario where you don't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's why you do scenario planning, is that you try to stretch your thinking around these different parameters and look at how they might emerge and how they might change the system that you're dealing with.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing the background of scenario planning and how it applies to climate change. It's very clear that we have to dive deeper and understand better the implications of the different scenarios you have just described. And we're going to do this in the next episode. So for today, I would like to thank you very much for your contribution.
My pleasure.
And we'll speak to you again.
Thank you.
For our audience, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series and explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. And you can also give us feedback by writing to sustainability@tcb.org. Thank you for listening, and please join us again for the next episode. For today, goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.